Today I would like to offer this order for our...
Hello!
Hello!
Hey!
Algis. I would like to offer for the same order like yesterday for our contributors to make presentations for 20 minutes, and then after two presentations we will have short somewhere about 20 or a little bit more minutes the questions and discussion. And if you agree, I see that nobody tried to protest about it. I would like to invite for the first presentation David Wolf from Rice University. So David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Labas rytas.
The floor, or the whole floor is yours.
The whole floor.
You can sell.
Good morning. I'm honored to be reading a paper here. Unlike some of the previous presenters, I was at a different OU. I did not go to Ohio. I studied with Eric Kramer at Oklahoma University, and through Eric met Algis. And I've known him for about 15 years in various locations, and had a great time learning from my academic grandfather. And yeah, probably one of my favorite memories in my education or my intellectual experience involves Algis. I'll save you the whole story, but just give you an image. Eating fresh ceviche, drinking a bucket of beer, of course, outside in Guatemala on a sunny day, learning. And I think that image summarizes a lot of my experience with Algis, so I'm quite honored to be here. And this paper, I chose this topic not because it has my last name in it, although I do like that about the topic. I can't help it. I thought the best way to, yes, self. I said to myself, self. I thought the best way to honor Al would be to choose a new topic for myself and try to learn and start to dialogue with him on this topic. So that's why I chose to deal with his idea of self-worth, mostly in paper, Transcendental Ground of All Values, and a little bit in an unpublished paper. One of my favorite things Al handed to me a long time ago, they wrote for a class called Discourse on Sancho Panzism, which is, I keep coming back to that essay all the time. It's, I must be an ass. So that's why I chose this paper, and I'll just read some of it. As I said, I thought the way to honor Al would be to choose a new topic and to begin a dialogue and to engage. So make it a learning experience for myself. So I tried to read the work carefully, put it in context of the other works that I have read from Algis, and raise a couple of questions in the paper. So, in the Transcendental Ground of All Values, Mickūnas makes a seemingly simple argument that he claims has application to all life worlds. He argues that the moment when the limits of a life world are realized, and that this awareness is even possible, that moment discloses the existence of self-worth. The argument is premised on the idea that life worlds provide frameworks for experience. When a life world fails to provide for the completion of an individual's perceived requirements for fulfilling his or her fullness as the self, the presence of another level of awareness is revealed. When I realize that a life world does not allow me to self-create autonomously, I have suspended my participation in that life world and become aware of it from another perspective. This perspectivity is the price of freedom to choose life worlds. Thus, according to Mickūnas, self-worth is grounding for all values. He applies this principle to the public sphere, concluding that the maintenance of a healthy public sphere is no longer possible because modern conceptions of the self have become temporalized, focused on permanence enhancement. This focus leads to the dominance of rhetoric that emphasizes security over all else. We're left with a polis that wants to avoid death more than it wants to elaborate on the possibilities of life. So the argument begins by drawing a distinction between constitution and construction. Constitutive intentionality opens an ethos that can or cannot be fulfilled in a given life world. Construction is a signative interconnection between all events and objectivities, including self-interpretation. For example, the West's obsession with economic value, which appears to define everything. Noting that values can only be evaluated by demonstrating the possibility of suspending them, Mickūnas argues that worth allows just this suspension, self-worth, not this worth, and appears in the background of all values. It's the ethos of the political enlightenment, providing for the question of the legitimacy of that life world. He notes that this worth is, and I'm quoting, present as absolute, arguing that through the principle of self-inclusion that it can't be negated without including itself. He then lays out the ethos of enlightenment, noting that it's composed of the subject-object dualism, unconditional autonomy, and equality of all subjects, the unquestionable nature of the methodology of subjects' interpretations, the invention of history as progress toward utopia, which has led to the abolition of the autonomy of human life, to the interpretation of life as fulfillment of material needs and the technological apparatus that fills those needs and creates new needs. It also includes the permanent deferral of the subject as self-created, because new needs always arise as a result of this condition, and a democracy, he claims, is currently without autonomous subjects. These characteristics have already become self-negating, according to Mickūnas. He concludes that value selectivity has become the basic mode of awareness for this life world, because anything can take on value as long as it serves our interests. And he notes that perception even depends on the ability to discern what's more valuable. In this life world, the human comes in second to values, since the environment takes precedence over the human, which is now just posited as another chemical and biological process in the environment. This deflection has the effect of abolishing rights and responsibilities. As a contingent biological process, we humans have no autonomy with which to maintain a democratic public sphere through participation. The result is contingent rhetoric over honesty. Lying to increase profit in business, for example, is seen as prudent, not just questionable even. The fundamental intentionality of this life world, or its preoccupation, or what it's most conscious of, according to Mickūnas, is temporal possibility, since the Enlightenment rejects transcendental and eternal, leaving an empty will without a specific location and time. We're positionless in time without temporal reference. We're left with the possibility of fulfilling our final mode as the beginning and end of this empty will of temporal possibility, shifting the emphasis from reason to instrumental rationality, making valuation a calculation of the material. He notes that to achieve any value, a human has to be reduced to a system of interests, needs, desires, power, and all must act accordingly against others to fulfill such wants. Since human life is interpreted as material and the psychological sum of those wants and their immediate gratification. Combined with the pressure to extend our lives using the latest technology, since we're convinced we have only the possibility of fulfilling our final mode, promises of ongoing security and continuity become the dominant mode of public discourse over the maintenance of freedom and, in fact, to its exclusion. Mickūnas notes that the transcendental mode of enlightenment as change as permanence enhancement, or is change as permanence enhancement. And he notes that we're in a period of transition between democracy and another not yet fully understood life world, which presumably also deals with permanence enhancement. Recognizing this crisis, however, according to Mickūnas, the ability to suspend participation in that particular life world, including this one, becomes possible. Specifically, he notes that the awareness of the destruction of autonomy and self-creation reveals the presence of intrinsic self-worth. The life world for Mickūnas is categorical epistemology. This awareness shows its failure as a mode of epistemic understanding. At this point, quoting, an existential question of action becomes preeminent. Can I act as I have always acted and fulfill the intention of my intrinsic self-worth? Mickūnas then lists honor, dignity, and respect as concepts that can't be fulfilled by activities in such a life world, and argues that this places that life world in absolute question, quoting, revealing the awareness of an absolute self-worth. And we should remind ourselves here that the sense of absolute is limited to the principle of self-inclusion, or that which can't be negated without its own inclusion. Setting aside for a moment the debate over the primacy of honor, dignity, and respect, we can note that in the unpublished paper I mentioned earlier, this is Sancho Panza's realization in the Discourse on Sancho Panza, where he realizes, quoting, "Yet one day I woke up and couldn't see playing the paterfamilias anymore, and that was that." And later, the same essay notes, "Within a game, everything has a reason, but what about without?" Mickūnas then notes, back to the original paper, that all forms of utilitarianism are valuations of the fulfillment of psychophysiological needs, and that, quoting, striving to fulfill pleasure suggests our complete subjection to irrational drives and a loss of any sense of autonomy. A more profound understanding of Enlightenment's failure may be found by looking at Kant's critical works, which Mickūnas refers to as the highest point of enlightenment in this situation. Here he notes that the universal imperative leads only to empty goodwill and argues for respect for it, simply as respect for the law, which implies a more basic sense of doing something for its own sake. To get value for having respect for the law, one must be able to stand outside of that concept and become aware of the value of doing something for its own sake, placing the treatment of others at the same level as treatment of ourselves. This suspension shows the reduction of the human to purposive value and, by implication, valuelessness. The recognition of the above compels one to bracket oneself out of play with the life world. Mickūnas' stated task here is to unfold the lived awareness that is compelled to bracket, and to note the presence of this lived awareness across diverse phenomena. He notes that even the most degraded of our time appear to have some element of self-worth. Racism, for example, presumes that its target has self-worth to be degraded in the first place, and that the desire to elevate oneself above another shows a disdain for the presence of the other's self-worth. We could add here that failing to value oneself also becomes a kind of strange quality that we question in another person. For people who appear to have no self-respect, it's a strange thing. So we say things like, "How can you do that? Don't you have any self-respect?" Mickūnas also presents as evidence examples that show even the presence of someone who has bracketed his or her participation in a, "How can you do that? Don't you have any self-respect?"
You have no self-respect.
His or her participation in the life world is a challenge to our own blind adherence in this life world. He notes that Gandhi took the blows with dignity and demanded the same dignity from those administering the blows. Socrates, he argues, grounded his search for truth in eudaimonia, demonstrating the difference between his life world and that of Athens. He accepted the verdict in his trial rather than surrender that which he felt was the fulfillment of his self-worth. He refused to end his suspension of participation and become a non-troublesome member of that society. And Mickūnas calls this the first crisis of democracy. But here we have to pause and ask a question. And I asked Algis this the other day already, well, what if honor is not a part of my idea of self-worth? Is this simply the point for Mickūnas, that the Enlightenment demands that we place existence over such ideas, yet we continue to hold things like honor as valuable? What if one views continued existence as primary? Does not that existence create the condition for self-worth? Is this the result of my inability to see outside of the Enlightenment, which my raising the question answers that with a no already? Suppose Socrates had simply agreed to stop causing trouble, been acquitted, and gone on with his life. Are we to conclude that this was a failure on his part, that he missed the point by failing to recognize the priority of self-worth? What if he had succumbed to Athens for the moment, only to go on to cause more trouble later? Would this not have been placing self-worth above all, by being expedient in the moment in the service of continuing his later work? This would seem to be the strategy of many social and political groups. There are some free market types in the US that value education, and they really do. But they think private competition and education for all would be best for society, so they actively work to undermine public education, hoping to render it ineffective in order to make education better in the long term. Sure, I think they're wrong, but they don't think they're wrong, and are acting according to what they think is honorable, using strategy to improve education. Do we judge this a failure of honor? I don't know. Perhaps this begs the question, does Mickūnas here mean that honor, dignity, and the like are prior to self-worth? A conception of self-worth that includes these concepts would seem to need an awareness of these phenomena, It would be revealed by a suspension of participation in life worlds that don't include them. For me to experience self-worth, do I not need these components to disclose it? The problem here is that worth is a rational concept. What something is worth can only be understood in comparison to something else. In a universe containing only one phenomenon, it would be all of the value for that universe, and so it would be no value. Thus we need at least two phenomena to create value. Then we might as well say that the value of the other is the ground of all value, since it creates the ratio, making the rational valuation. Mickūnas grants this argument, stating that the recognition of the other's intrinsic worth is also recognition of one's own. But perhaps the other term is self-creation. To continue explicating Mickūnas' argument, we can note that his next example is Nietzsche's cosmic awareness. Nietzsche showed the devaluation of values, noting that self-worth is self-creation for its own sake. Only cosmic awareness is adequate for human self-creation, making the universe the life world. This leads us to the Don Quixote example. Quixote, an individual in transition between life worlds, asks, if I have only one life, is such a life an authentic representation of intrinsic worth if I were to live this life in the life world of the Iron Age? He had access to another world through reading, and because of that, he's in a position to suspend his participation and ask that question. So Quixote sees honor, etc., because he had that other access. Given our previous two examples, we must ask what evidence that there is that the universe, as the life world, intrinsically includes these concepts. As noted above, this would seem necessary to demonstrate self-worth. He's shown self-worth as a kind of negation of life worlds. Where or when is it a positive attribute of a life world? Only in fiction, like Don Quixote read. One might ask how we can show it, and its components are part of the universe. The answer appears to be that it's part of the universe because we're discussing it. And I have a long quotation here from Algis, which I'll skip. He continues, noting that this awareness is that the awareness of this is the transcendental background on which any life world must be legitimated, concerning its adequacy for fulfilling such awareness in activity. So because the self must be posited in any life world, and since a life world is perspectivity, the possibility for valuing the self becomes a constant background, since there will always be the question of one's relation to that life world. Once one is able to select among life worlds, this condition has already occurred. Humans dominated by a mythic outlook or magic awareness, to speak from a Gabsarian standpoint, would neither select among life worlds nor perceive self-worth as a part of the process. In their case, the question doesn't come up. Thus, Mickūnas identifies a modern phenomenon. And, okay, I'll just read a little more. From here, he moves into the argument applying to democracy and points out the crisis of democracy lies in the following. Democracy requires the maintenance of self-worth, which in turn requires the establishment of a public domain in which every person must fulfill her self-worth for its own sake. These require, then, permanent maintenance of the public domain for its own sake. Valuations, however, put us at odds with each other as we deny the self-worth of others in order to advance valuations. Thus, valuations disrupt the permanence of self-worth. When pushed out of participation through this competitive process, or when we select out of it because of lack of knowledge of the issues, the public domain and our self-worth within it vanish. Mickūnas is careful to note that these are not objects of knowledge that are constituted in our active engagement, and autonomy may become reduced to free choice. The founding of democracy led to a partial fulfillment of self-worth, but it became mixed up with science. Eventually, categorical statements about the value of particular people as honorable, etc., became labels that could be acquired through money or influence. The language labels could be applied without the enactment previously required to give existence to those labels. This is easy to see in the modern world. Media representations can create something that's never been enacted. As Baudrillard showed in his book, The Gulf War did not take place. Once categorization substantivated people, the quest to return to activities that could be the sole understanding of what such categories mean was abandoned. Accordingly, Mickūnas argues for a shift from categorical epistemic understanding that depends on second and third grammatical persons to a first person self-understanding and the recognition that the latter is not a narrowing down of the epistemic categorical field, but has a very different logic. Categorical emphasis finds truth in the fulfillment of a proposition. Existential emphasis finds truth in enactment, as in an honorable act of not lying. The categorical is general, the existential is singular. And I'm almost finished. Enlightenment gave rise to self-worth, which immediately revealed its limit, the Enlightenment's limit. Self-worth immediately enables the questioning of that life world. This questioning places the life world out of play in its quest for authentic fulfillment of self-worth. When a life world containing honor is placed out of play, it becomes chronoscopic according to Mickūnas, revealing an atemporal, non-positional awareness experienceable only from chronoscopic awareness. This life world without the human is exposed to temporality, because phenomena like honor exist only through enactment. Striving to fulfill a category such as honor is chronoscopic as well. The disclosure of intrinsic worth is as atemporally present, but only chronoscopically experienced, requires a specific constitution of activity, that's a quotation, in which awareness of the world is awareness of the self, reflected as awareness turned toward the world. Being aware of this, Mickūnas calls the essence of activity and argues that it demands legitimation as to the worth of an action.